Well, let me welcome everyone to this IISS discussion meeting with Professor Dennis Gormley on the subject of cruise missiles and NATO missile defense under the radar titled. Dennis is a longtime friend of IISS, actually part of the family. He was a research associate here some years back and a consulting senior fellow in 2002. He about a decade ago, wrote an Adelphi book on the subject of cruise missiles. And so he's returning to that subject, for which I should have said, the very first thing I should say is, Dennis is the world's leading expert on cruise missiles. So you're lucky. He'll tell you more than you'll ever know, want to know. Need more than you've ever known. You want to know more. And he's an expert generally on various other matters, of course, including various issues regarding missile. He wrote an acclaimed book in 2008 on missile contagion. And as you'll know from the bio that went around, he has a background in military, in intelligence, in academia, in different positions in think tank communities and universities. And I'm really delighted to welcome you back. It's been a few years since you've spoken at Arundel House, but Dennis is a frequent participant in IISS meetings elsewhere, including one earlier this year in Washington. So I'm all ears to learn more about cruise missiles and NATO missile defense.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And it's, of course, a delight to be back at IISS. So I want to thank you for setting up this meeting, to give me an opportunity to talk about a subject that it's easy to be the world's expert on cruise missiles because no one seems to care about them, other than the countries that use them quite amply, and that is my own country. But I also want to thank the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, in Paris, for giving me the opportunity to prepare a proliferation paper, number 41, which, if you're interested in any of the comments I make today, my comments are largely drawn from that, and the extent to which I've been able to update it since it appeared last spring. And it has the very same title. If you go to the IFRI website, you can download it. The question at hand is whether or not NATO should give adequate consideration to the full range of missile threats that I would argue could challenge NATO, particularly in light of its decision to broaden its missile defense ambitions from simply point defense to broad protections of NATO territory and population centers. In fact, I suppose I could argue that in some sense that broader consideration of this particular threat is more ambitious than even the United States with respect to its homeland defense ambitions. The new strategic concept that underlies this wish to go from point to full protection, so to speak, emphasized, and I quote, the need to be effective in a changing world of new threats. And boy, if you go back and look at NATO statements preceding particularly important meetings of NATO, you'll see that the same words chosen every time. It's a natural ambition to recognize that there are new threats that emerge and we need to be prepared to defend against them or to deal with them in some important way. And I went back and I found during a very similar period, 1994, the very same words appeared in a similar document about being in a position to respond to new emerging threats. And that was in 1994, post-Cold War, dealing with shrinking defense budgets. And out of that came a recognition that we need to deal with both ballistic missile and cruise missile threats. And in fact, in 1994, created the conditions for the it created the conditions for the MEADS program, which you may be familiar with, which has some modest capacity to deal with cruise missile systems, and a program that, interestingly, is on its deathbed today, as are many other ambitious programs to deal with the cruise missile threat, which we'll deal with later. But it's interesting to compare the two periods and to see what happened in between to lead to this period of time in the way we deal with threats, to singularly focus on the ballistic missile threat to the exclusion of the land attack cruise missile threat. And here I'm talking principally about land attack cruise missiles, because that's the new threat that's emerged. And anti-ship cruise missiles have been around forever, since the 60s. Inventories of 75,000 around the world. But land attack cruise missiles did not begin to emerge in any significant form until 2004. Much belated, by the way, which we'll talk about. So let me outline 5 areas that I'll touch on very briefly because of time. Why the second-class status? First, I'll attempt to address that. Post-2004, what explains the emergence of cruise missile threats belatedly in 2004, and what kinds of things, the third factor is, what kinds of things are really propelling it forward? Because IFRI asked me in my paper to go from my book, 2008 to 2012, and what new developments have occurred? And believe me, the contagion is continuing of the spread of cruise missiles. Fourth, what plausible threats might NATO face from, in particular, Iran, since Iran's ballistic missile threat is what seems to animate our ambitions to create a full missile defense system for NATO. And then, number 5 and last, what can we do at best, given the stringency of contemporary circumstances, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well, to deal with the cruise missile threat? So, number 1, why the second-class status? And I can't help but call attention to Tom Schilling's comment in Roberta Wohlstetter's book, which I lead off my IFRI paper with, which, if you'll let me quote it, is important. And it says a lot about the difficulty of dealing with a secondary threat, a lesser included threat. There is a tendency in our planning to confuse the unfamiliar with the improbable. The contingency we have not considered seriously looks strange. What looks strange is thought to be improbable. And what is improbable need not be considered seriously. Boy, if there's anything, I mean, that was written with respect to Pearl Harbor and the surprise at Pearl Harbor. And cruise missiles fall into that category for lots of important reasons, not least from an intelligence collection standpoint. We have very few capabilities that are able to deal in a similar fashion that we can deal with detecting ballistic missiles, large plumes, space-based systems that can detect launches, but nothing akin to that in the cruise missile area. So we're very prone to being surprised, as we were beginning in 2004. So back to 1994, NATO set up these very important two committees, one dealing with the political military side of proliferation, and the other dealing with the military dimensions of proliferation. And they created these committees that led to the requirement for MEADS that I mentioned. So it appeared like we were headed at least in the right direction in terms of balancing cruise and ballistic missile defense as an important problem. What happened in the aftermath of that? Well, I guess the simplest way that I would explain it is, you know, we worry about politicization of intelligence. Well, we beginning in 1994, we in the United States had to deal with the politicization of ballistic missile defense and all missile defense, generally speaking. And that was, you know, it started out with the so-called contract with America that the Republicans put together that set out a simple list of about 5 objectives that would occur should they take over the House of Representatives. They did take over the House of Representatives, and one of the primary areas of emphasis was to deploy immediately a national ballistic missile defense system. And out of that, I think Senator Sam Nunn, captured the best way of explaining what happened to the debate in the United States. And I quote, he said, "National missile defense has become a theology in the United States, not a technology." And if you look at all of the various commissions that were set up between 1990 and 2004, it represented a fixation, singular fixation on the ballistic missile threat. Started in 1995, the National Intelligence Estimate 9519 on the ballistic missile threat to the United States engendered a wrath of negativity on the part of the Congress, stating that it understated the ballistic missile threat and when it would emerge. And a Gates panel was created in 1996 to peer review the National Intelligence Estimate. It had equal number of Democrats to Republicans, came out and said, in fact, it didn't go far enough in reducing the threat, not inflating the threat. The Congress didn't like that result, so they threw that out and they commissioned the Rumsfeld Commission, famously, in 1998. And conveniently, within weeks of the submission of the Commission report, we had a launch of a Taibudong-1, and that event, I would argue, I might be exaggerating slightly, galvanized support for national missile defense. In 1998, the National Missile Defense Act passed by 97-3 in the Clinton administration. Now, an addendum to the National Defense Act was to only deploy when technologically feasible. And of course, President Clinton said it was not technologically feasible as he left office and did not deploy. George Bush became president and not only deployed, but left the ABM treaty. And the rest is history. All during that same period, unbeknownst to the general public, there were as many as 10 similar kinds of august studies done on the cruise missile threat. And they published reports all essentially arguing it's going to emerge, it's going to emerge, and it's going to be sudden, and we're going to be surprised. And we need to hedge against it. And what hedging in the United States means is we've got to focus on engineering and manufacturing development. Don't deploy it in advance of its emergence, but be in a position where we can act quickly to pull technology components out of the system and deploy them rather quickly in a year or two, say, rather than 6 months. And we did that. We did a lot. We did a lot of work on sensor systems, airborne platforms, and prepared ourselves for what then occurred in later on. So the second-class status, in many respects, is largely because of this singular focus on ballistic missile issues. So the threat belatedly emerges in 2004. The Chinese conduct a long-range cruise missile, land attack cruise missile test. The Indians had been working on a variety of programs, most importantly a co-development program with Russia called the BrahMos cruise missile. The Pakistani surprised everyone in 2005 by launching its own cruise missile system. And then surprising countries like South Korea announced in 2006 it had 4 land attack cruise missile programs underway, one of which was 1,500 kilometers in range and could, by the way, not only attack North Korea, but Japan and and South Korea. And China. So all of the ancient animosities in Northeast Asia were being wrapped around this emergence of multiple cruise missile programs in the region. The factors shaping in my book, I deal with 3 major factors. And certainly the interest that was stirred by virtue of the United States depending importantly for the first time on cruise missiles as the leading edge attack in the 1991 war with Iraq, animated a lot of interest in countries, not least India and China, that did major studies looking at the military implications of cruise missiles. But the 3 factors I deal with, I'll talk very briefly about, and if you're interested, you can check out my book. The first is knowledge. It's knowledge, narrative, and norms. Knowledge is the specialized kinds of technical capabilities that are needed to truly develop an advanced land attack cruise missile. The analysts who had worked on this problem that said that by the end of the 1990s we would have broad proliferation of land attack cruise missiles simply underestimated the technology challenges associated with cruise missile development. I mean, they looked at the GPS availability, the component technologies that were broadly available in the dual use community, and they simply took that and said, cruise missiles are going to spread. You can go out to, the store and buy all the components and put it together. I'm exaggerating, but that essentially was the essence of the argument. No, it's more important. I mean, the United States has 40 years of what I call forensic engineering experience with the Tomahawk and its other cruise missile systems that truly turns these systems into precise delivery systems that are capable of very accurate use. But it's taken 40 years of accumulated forensic engineering experience to reach that point. The second is narrative, and the narrative is fairly straightforward. I argue that you could barely find evidence of countries saying they were interested in land attack cruise missiles prior to the 2003 war with Iraq, based on their ability to penetrate missile defenses. After 2003, in 2003, of course, the United States was presented with 5 primitive cruise missiles that were launched by Iraq. We detected and shot down none of them. And we had fratricide problems where we were shooting down our own aircraft, and that inability contributed to those events. And Army officials in the aftermath of that war came out and said, absolutely, we need to do something about this issue, because the next war, we're going to be presented with a much more serious threat. And we haven't done anything since 2003. In fact, the situation arguably is worse. Norms are the various regimes in place, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and its comparative effectiveness with respect to dealing with ballistic missile proliferation versus cruise missile proliferation, I argue, is decidedly, in the same sense as missile defense, errs on the side of, or weighs on the side of worrying more about ballistic missile proliferation than cruise missile proliferation. And the other norm that I spun into because I saw it developing in all of the countries, virtually all of the countries that were developing new cruise missile systems, was a tendency to wrap them in preemptive strike doctrines. Not least, I think, animated by the virtue of seeing the United States elevate preemption as an option that every country has to a national doctrine in 2002 in the Bush administration. Really prevention rather than preemption. But countries pointed to this as the reasons why they were interested in preemption. So you see this breakout and being wrapped in new cruise missile programs was an interesting phenomenon. So that drove things. Let me show some slides. I want to turn to now what, if to the extent that NATO does anything with respect to the cruise missile issue, it relates to Iran, it seems to me. And yeah, I'm going to show 5 slides, pictures of missile systems. This is a Chinese HY-2 or 4, it could be, depending on what engine came to Iran in the first place. And it is now called the RAD missile in Iran. Probably has around 300 kilometers range. But the virtue of this particular missile is its sheer volume, size. Because actually I was asked by our government in 1997 to do a study of to what extent could you transform the anti-ship cruise missile, the HY-2, into a land attack cruise missile. And what we found is by virtue of removing all of the ancient components of the HY-2, it provided enormous space, most importantly, for extending the range of the missile, because you had additional space for fuel bladders. And then the challenge of dealing with center of gravity problems. But I don't want to get into too much technical detail. But it turns out it's an excellent system for emerging countries. China used it as a test bed back in the early 1990s to look at a land attack cruise missile system. So Iran, not surprisingly, with a very close relationship in the illegal proliferation area with China, has benefited, I would argue, from assistance from China in this regard. So what's interesting about the other factor is you can put it in a 12-meter shipping container. And I'm going to come back and touch on, two-stage launch. It's not just the distance you fly, from launch to target. It's can you get closer to the target by virtue of putting it on a ship and forward basing it and getting closer to the potential target system. Which one is this? Yeah, it's the rod again. Okay, the Karar is an armed aerial drone. It seems like everyone's doing armed drones these days, and at least in a seemingly clumsy way. Iran is as well. This turns out more than likely to be a South African missile called the Skua, which has been transformed into an armed drone. And it has about 1,000 kilometers of range and about carrying a very light payload of about 230 kilograms. The next system probably is the most worrisome because of its sheer range. And this is the KH-55, nuclear-capable Russian, Ukrainian cruise missile, land attack cruise missile, 3,000 kilometers range, I think I mentioned that. And both China and Iran illegally obtained between 12 and 20 each of these missiles back in 2000 and 2001, respectively. And ever since, there have been rumors floating around about reverse engineering of the KH-55. If I had time, I would go into my discussion of reverse engineering. I once worked in the U.S. intelligence community on reverse engineering programs of equipment, of foreign equipment that we got our hands on. And it's much, much more difficult than meets the, the conventional wisdom. It's much more challenging, particularly when you don't get the engineering drawings and blueprints with the original design, and you have to take it apart and reassemble it and come up with precise measurements and then do all the tooling and et cetera. And inevitably what you come up with is a rough replica, but it's a new missile. It's your own missile. And the successful replicas that have truly taken place have been in countries like the former Soviet Union and China, which went to the original designers of the systems they replicated and had the designers working in their reverse engineering team. So it's cheating in effect, but it makes it easier. What's interesting about this? The claim that it's going to be reverse engineered, and 2 days before I arrived here in London, there was an announcement by the Iranians that very soon, probably in the late part of September, and they made this announcement a year ago as well, they will uncover a 2,000-kilometer range land attack cruise missile system called the Mercat. And launched from air, land, and sea systems. The devil's in the details, of course, but the general notion is that this seems to be, it's 1,000 kilometers less range. The biggest challenge for the replicating the KH-55 was getting an advanced turbofan propulsion system that would bring it to that lengthy range. But 2,000 kilometers, the way the Iranians characterize it is that's the range of the Shahab-3. So we can attack Israel, we can attack southeastern NATO territory, and not surprisingly, 2 stories came out, one after the other. The second story was, oh, and by the way, this is going to penetrate your missile defenses. So the narrative I referred to before, the Iranians have taken that up as well. And when they make this announcement, they accompany it with, it can penetrate missile defenses. Okay, the next system is the 3M-14, and this is a short-range land attack cruise missile that comes part and parcel with this system. Isn't that an interesting system? It's called a Club K container system. And it comes in a 12-meter shipping container. The front end of it, which you can see on the left, has a small compartment for command and control and targeting. It includes 4 land attack cruise missiles or anti-ship cruise missiles. And it can be placed on a rail car, a flatbed rail car. It can be placed in a in a shipping container ship that carries 12-meter shipping containers. Or they also demonstrate on their website it in a road mobile configuration, or on a train. I'm sorry. So train, truck, and ship launched options. And the only mention of extremely interested customers includes Venezuela and Iran.
And who's selling these?
The Russians. Yep. Well, we can get into a discussion as time permits of what problems the Russians would face from within the missile technology control regime to legitimate the sale of this particular system, even though it does not meet the Category 1 conditions of the missile technology control regime. It clearly is a Category 2 system and subject to some degree of controls, particularly if you're selling it to a country that's feared to have weapons of mass destruction ambitions. And I believe Iran falls into that category.
And so what's the range and the payload?
300 kilometers range, but, you know, or 299. You know, and the Russians do that because, you know, it falls under the 300. There's a lot more range you can get from cruise missiles if you fly them at higher altitudes, and you know it's more efficient use of fuel. And it has about a 425 kilogram payload. So keep in mind this two-stage launch opportunity, because it may fall into the category of, you know, we tend to, when I talk to people in our State Department, for example, they'll say that, oh my God, the cruise missile threat is a serious threat, and we need to be sensitive to it. We need to improve our capacity against it. But, you know, in respect to NATO's missile defense, the cruise missile threat is really a theater threat. It's not a strategic threat. It doesn't have the range of ballistic missiles, which somehow, you know, to Israel, you know, Syria is a couple of 100 kilometers away. So a missile with 200 kilometers range is a strategic missile. So it all depends where you sit and what kinds of threats could come your way. So this is very important to keep in mind, because this fits Tom Schilling's, you know, a notion of, you know, what we don't, you know, in the end take seriously is because of, you know, it seems so improbable. But there are ways of getting around improbability. Okay. So let me turn now and finally to what could Iran plausibly do? Well, it really falls into two broad categories. The two-range options, and that, you know, has begun to seep out with its, you know, roughly a year ago ambitions, where they actually entered the Mediterranean with a small number of ships, and their expressions of interest in setting up an operating position in the Atlantic as well. When that materializes remains to be seen. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Navy also talking about a more prominent role, at least in the Persian Gulf, if not outside that area. So the two-stage option could include taking the HY, the Chinese missiles that they've turned into 300-plus kilometer range systems, and using them from ships, either Navy ships, their own Navy ships, or more covertly on merchant ships. The worrisome thing there is the very close relationship of Iran's Navy, its IRG Navy as well, and the Iran shipping lines to skirt U.S. sanctions by virtue of making its container fleet problematic in terms of finding out who owns what and who's on first, so to speak. So that the opacity associated with that is worrisome in connection with the kind of Russian option that's on display and their capacity to do it with their own systems, not just to turn to Russia if that ever materializes. The second is the worrisome development of this Meshkat, the system that was just announced, that appears to be related to either, I didn't mention, but the other, I think, alternative theory to taking the KH-55 as the basis for this 2,000 kilometer range new land attack cruise missile is a Tomahawk, based on the Tomahawk exploitation by China, derived from missiles recovered by Pakistan in fairly good shape, given to China and declared to be reverse engineered and now perhaps showing up, or at least some new engine technology showing up in a new Iranian system. Okay, to give you guys a chance to question me, let me end with what can we do about this? I have a whole list, and the IFRI paper goes into extensive detail on all of the U.S. cruise missile defense programs and the NATO, the MEADS program, that have been canceled over the last decade. And, you know, it begins with our best, and most of these, I would note, are oriented less so to protecting the U.S. homeland and more so to allowing the U.S. to project forces, the U.S. and its allies to project forces into harm's way and to deal with, you know, large numbers of cruise missiles. But they still had some interesting capacity to deal with you know, strikes against NATO under, you know, different contingency conditions. All of this is important to note because there is a tendency to look at our air defense systems, and you name them, the European systems, the Patriot, which started out as an air defense system, and now does missile defense, and the manufacturers claim it does cruise missile defense as well, and it has that objective. But it has to be linked to something. It's called an architecture of principally to do a good job, overhead sensors, to give you battle space time, to allow you to have many minutes, ideally 25 to 30 minutes of time, where you can share radar information with your friends who also have the capacity to deal with this and transfer not just surveillance information, but tracking information to allow them to use their missile against these kinds of threats that fly very low and in some cases have, you know, very low radar cross sections. That is important. You know, it's called, you know, the single integrated air picture, combat ID, integrated missile defense. It's supposed to deal with both cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, but it's a program in name only. So all of these programs, the MEADS is on life support, very expensive life support, almost $1 billion the U.S. has to spend to prove the concept and then leave the program because it believes that the concept will not prove out to be worth the money associated with it. The U.S. SLAM-RAM program, $650K per interceptor, was too expensive. The Army shut it down. The E-10A, the most high-performing airborne sensor because it has a large AESA, airborne electronically scanned antenna, 4 by 21 feet in size. That would have been an ideal system for long-range detection of low radar cross-section threats. That program was shut down in roughly 2008. Putting a 2 by 21 AESA radar on the Joint Stars was terminated as well. So you're left with Global Hawk, which has a 1 by 4 AESA radar on it, which on the U.S. system has been declared to be so negligible in terms of its capacity to deal with the cruise missile detection threat that it has no plans for using it against cruise missiles. So what's left? The Navy's E-2D, which is their equivalent of the AWACS program, and it has a very high-powered AESA radar, but it's oriented toward dealing with the anti-ship threat to Navy vessels, not to dealing with targets over land. And in fact, I'm told in my interviews that it has modest capability to deal with land attack cluttered environments. So the Army's JLINS program, which is 2 aerostats per system that fly at about 4,500 meters not at the altitudes that the E-10 or the Joint Stars would fly at 35,000 feet. They're flying at 12,000 feet or so. So they're getting less range, and you can use mountains to avert their detection. But it does have some modest capacity should it be able to deal with the high winds that have presented problems to the Army, and the capacity to use a fairly low caliber weapon to shoot it down, but it does land gracefully. The Lockheed Martin company, in about 2 years ago, had a presentation in Washington to do preferential defense between Boston and Washington, D.C., with the use of airships and Patriot, 2 programs that are Lockheed Martin programs. And they talked about roughly in the several billions of dollars to do preferential defense. First, preferential defense is a non-starter politically for all the obvious reasons. And if you multiply out the demands to protect a continent or a large area, like NATO Europe or the continental United States, you're talking in the range of, back in 2000, the numbers that were in the $40 to $50 billion region, and that are higher today, no doubt. So what are we left with? We're left with the capacity to use airplanes with AESA radars, small AESA radars, to react to strategic warning. And how do we deal with strategic warning? It's a very difficult issue, but one that NATO navies would play a role in, I would argue, to monitor the merchant vessels and Iranian naval vessels in the Mediterranean and should they go into the Atlantic. The collaboration necessary between NATO intelligence organizations to focus on issues like collection and analysis of Iran's, shipping operations and the opaqueness that comes with that. And thirdly, to deal with rules of engagement, because the big challenge is going to be you're not going to have a tip-off from some high-powered radar that there's an object out there that clearly is an enemy low-flying cruise missile, as opposed to, in a few years, the ubiquity of drones flying in friendly airspace. So you've got to establish very stringent rules of engagement. Otherwise, you're going to start shooting down your own commercial aircraft, indeed, no less drones. And then fourth, acknowledge that you're doing something about the threat. That's, the narrative that I talked about that's the Energizer bunny of the spread of cruise missiles, that it can penetrate missile defenses, is in large measure because we say nothing about the issue of cruise missile defense. And I suppose in many respects that's fair because we're not doing very much and we've had all these program cancellations. But we are doing something. And so we need to say more about what we're doing and what we have, and link them to the kinds of measures, very simple, affordable measures that I've outlined here. And that would be an important start. I haven't talked anything about non-proliferation, the MTCR. The MTCR is on shaky ground with respect to all unmanned air systems, if you've read ISS publications. And I think that's a fair assessment. So there's a lot of things that could be done in the non-proliferation area that are worthy of investigation, but I'll hold that off for your questions, perhaps.
Thanks very much, Dennis. We do have about 15 minutes for discussion, and I'd like to take the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. I want to clarify, I want to get something straight in my own mind, because I think it's going to be on the exam. The systems that you talked about Iran maybe acquiring, of them, the ones that are capable of carrying a nuclear device, a nuclear weapon, would be the KH-55 and then potentially, you said something about Meshcat system based on a Tomahawk, which potentially China would have shared, but I don't know. Evidence of, I mean, the KH-55, we know that the Ukrainians said that they'd given it to Iran, but has there been any evidence of Iran having done anything with that, or is it just one wouldn't see anything because it's impossible to see the tests, as you said?
Yeah. Well, there are really two questions there. One, nuclear capability of land attack cruise missiles, broadly speaking. And when Pakistan launched its first cruise missile, it said this will be a nuclear capable cruise missile. And if you look at the volume of space in the front end, it's certainly, for the kinds of reported designs that China in particular has been passing around, which are, for relatively small designs. The virtue of putting it on a cruise missile is it doesn't have to undergo the stress of reentry and all the rigors of undergoing reentry. In this 1997 study that I briefly made mention to, we looked at the HY-2 and whether there was sufficient volume to develop. The MTCR is predicated on a 500 kilogram first generation nuclear warhead. I think we're past that stage now where you can get designs that are lighter and less volume that can be put into systems if you believe that the fact that China is passing around blueprints, but blueprints are one thing, actually doing it is quite another. So that still remains problematic, but there is a sufficient space in these systems. And certainly Israel, which has, I trust, a much more robust design team than the countries we're talking about, has reportedly gotten it into a very thin Popeye expanded range cruise missile that shocked a lot of people that they could get a design into that system. And it's, of course, Israel doesn't acknowledge the existence of the system, but it's pretty well known that it's deployed on submarines.
What size are we talking about?
I'll get you the.
Okay, that's good. Okay, a lot of questions here. Gentleman in the third row is the first one who caught my eye, right in the middle of the third row here. If you could introduce yourself, and then we'll come up here, and then over here.
Hi, Andrew Brooks used to be here as the aerospace analyst. So,
I'm sorry, Andrew, I should have recognized you.
It's okay, Mark. I'm not with you on all this because I think you're making dare I say it, you're making a problem that doesn't exist. And there's a lot of people who out there are quite happy to fund a problem that doesn't exist in order to make a solution to it. What do I actually say? If you want to lob a nuclear weapon at somebody, you go ballistic because it can't be shot at. You don't take a bimbly thing like this that can be shot down at 500 knots or whatever, that takes hours to get there, etc., etc. So you get yourself an OV2 and you can lob one in and the technology's there. If you're going to put 400 kilograms of high explosive in there, what's that going to do? I mean, the Germans launched V2s at us. There was a ton in the front. The average death toll, 1 per missile. Mm-hmm. So it's not really a good cost-benefit analysis. So I can't quite see where you think the bad guys are going to use this when they could be sending some guy with a suitcase down the tube with biological. That's a lot easier. They could be getting a V2, that's a lot more effective. They could be at a UAV to lob from Hamas into Israel, which again, you can buy for $5,000 on eBay. Mm-hmm. This doesn't seem to fit any niche at all that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, okay. Why don't you answer that, if you can.
Yeah. No, I think I can. Well, first, I would say that the argument you used, I refer you to the Gates panel, which you can download on the internet, and go to that, because what the Gates panel says is essentially that the intelligence community in the NIE 9519 underestimated the threat that might emanate from the kinds of things that you just argued were inconceivable because you can do it other ways, et cetera. et cetera, which I acknowledge to be true. What they said was the intelligence community dismissed. They said, one, it was technologically feasible, but two, that the motive wasn't there because there are, other ways that you could do it. And the Gates panel concluded by stipulating a whole variety of what they argued were logical reasons why that option should be something that the United States should, because we were talking about threats to the United States, should seriously entertain. And, and I think the more important answer is, go read my book. The cruise missiles are everywhere. They're breaking out everywhere in numbers that it's impossible to conclude that when you look at the number of countries that are doing it, and not just first world countries, but countries that are looking at the option seriously and either purchasing it, developing their own, albeit crudely at first. But it's got to, and I would argue that your characterization of the simplicity of defending against them was disabused by, the 2003 war, where, we failed altogether with systems that, in theory, were supposed to have robust capacity to deal with cruise missiles. They're very difficult, and as the skies become more cluttered, they get even more difficult.
Thank you. Well, I'll bet Andrew has a follow-up, but the advantage of being the speaker is you get the last word. So let's go up here to the front row if we could, please.
Thank you very much. Ted C. I'm with BASIC here in London. Professor Gormley, looking at the normative regimes that you touched on briefly, from a practical point of view, people are saying that the MTCR has done a reasonably good job of dealing with the ballistic missile threat. I'm not sure that's a fair characterization. If you look at the proliferation cluster that's taken place between China, India, and Pakistan in particular, you've got 3 nuclear-armed and other WMD-armed countries which have increasingly capable ballistic missiles and cruise missiles available to them. Mm-hmm. That's not a part of the world that fills me with a warm, fuzzy feeling about the success of the MTCR. But that said, do you see a conceptual problem with trying to deal with modern threats to security by means of sort of single issue control regimes? One attempts to control the delivery systems, one attempts to control biological, one does chemical, 1, 2, 3 and a half do nuclear. Now the problem here is that, as has been pointed out, a ballistic missile in and of itself is not a huge threat. It becomes a huge threat when there is a meaningful payload. Now, is there any value in your mind to trying and tackle the problem of ballistic missile plus WMD or cruise missile plus WMD? And can you sort of get a handle for how we might approach something like that?
Yeah. Boy, it's a demanding question in the sense that, my first reaction to it is that there have been a number of conceptual ideas that have been introduced over the last decade. Let me just mention one, globalize INF, for example. I fit into that category that would argue that we fall prey to allowing the best to become the enemy of the good by turning away from attempts at bolstering these very imperfect regimes, which I would agree with your argument that we're not stopping missile proliferation, either ballistic or cruise, in states that are not parties to the regime. And they find ways of working around the system, not least via countries like China and Russia that, selectively declare that there are entities that they have no control over, or they have export control systems that are imperfect because it's relatively new to them. So my own predilection would be to not allow the best to become the enemy of the good and focus on what we have in place now that I would argue over time, even in the case of cruise missile proliferation, there have been periods in the MTCR between 1998 and 2002, for example, which there was a whole rash of very, very technically detailed improvements that occurred in the technology annex to the MTCR that nobody except for Philadelphia lawyers or missile specialists, care to study. But they were important, they're important at the licensing portion of the problem. So I think we still need to focus on that and deal with the issue of the breakout of UAVs. I think that's the biggest threat to the MTCR is the Pentagon just came out with a list of 66 countries that they would wish to sell. They haven't mentioned which systems, but I'm sure Predator and Reaper, which are Category 1 systems, are on that list.
Ed, thanks for getting us on to the non-proliferation questions. Lady Kennett, the next question, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the second row here.
Elizabeth Young, alternatively Lady Kennedy. The Poles are not content with the American proposals for missile defense in Europe. Is your analysis part of their problem? Are they worried about cruise missiles? Do they specifically see this as something which other people are not taking adequately into account?
Yeah, that's an excellent observation.
Can you just repeat the observation? I'm not sure everybody caught it.
Yeah, Lady Kennett asked about Poland and its objection to the phase adaptive plan of the Obama administration to the extent that they feel like they're not getting enough protection that was embedded in the original Bush proposal to provide, they argue, better defense. You could argue with that, but I'll put that aside. But what is interesting is the countermeasures that Russia has talked about, that from a two-stage system, moving Russian both ballistic missile and cruise missile systems sufficiently close, about 500 kilometers away, that are capable of targeting Poland. And I would argue that the reasons why you see the U.S. in the phase adaptive plan talking to Poland about the sale of Patriot missiles is because Patriot would be the system that would arguably be best configured, with the exception of the cruise missile issue, to deal with those kinds of threats. And in fact, I would argue that the reason why the Russians have talked about both ballistic and cruise is because they realize the shortcomings in cruise missile defense. So yes, they're still upset, but there's a new dimension to this. If any of you haven't seen, yesterday the National Research Council in the United States released a 239-page report, technical report, basically challenging the phase adaptive plan, particularly the fourth phase of it, to deal with ICBM threats to the United States, arguing that it's insufficient to deal with the kinds of plausible developments that might occur in a 10-plus year time span. And this is something that I trust that Mark will take up, and you must, is the optimism that is embedded in that in terms of threat assessment for Iran's development of both countermeasures and reentry vehicles that can really place the U.S. at risk, notwithstanding the best technology that the U.S. can. Basically, the National Research Council wants us to go back to the Bush plan, put a new site in the eastern United States, and develop new interceptors. And I won't say any more about that issue, but it's all of those issues are still open, but certainly your question was apropos. The Polish do worry about countermeasures on the part of Russia should Russia continue to be concerned about the capacity of the United States to attrit their retaliatory force.
We've reached the 1 o'clock closing time, but I did say that I would call on the gentleman in the second row, and I apologize. Others, we should end at 1
Thank you.
o'clock. So
My
last
name's
question.
Norman Moss. I'm just a member of the ISS. First of all, I'd add to the delivery systems that Andrew behind me mentioned, the Cessna aircraft, which, as we know, flew under the Galosh radar system and landed off Red Square. I have a fundamental conceptual doubt or anxiety about any kind of missile defense. Because it seems to me when you're dealing with nuclear warheads, the threat is there. Unless you have 100% defense, and nobody's suggesting we have that, then the threat is always there. So long as there's a good chance that another nation can land 2 or 3 missiles, or even 1 missile, with a nuclear warhead on, for example, a NATO city, NATO will be deterred from taking any action that might risk nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
The short answer to that is the offense always has an advantage over the defense. We've forgotten the important rule that was set up by none other than Paul Nitze, called cost effectiveness at the margin. And when you look at the cost, particularly of cruise missiles, far less so with ballistic missiles, to the cost of the capacity to defend against them. And it's not just the cost of the interceptor, it's the cost of the architecture for the system. It pales in comparison. The cost effectiveness at the margin has gone away. It's disappeared from the debate. And it's part of what I mentioned Sam Nunn's argument is we're talking about theological issues. It's, you know, the first obligation of a president is to defend the people. So you spend enormous quantities of money on an impossible task. The cruise missile dilemma makes that even more impossible, I would argue. And do I share your concern? The reason why I argue we need to pay attention to both is if we're going to spend these sums on ballistic missile defense, take a little bit out of it and focus on the other, because we don't want the narrative to continue to spin out that is energizing all these countries to acquire cruise missiles for reasons that are beyond me.
Dennis, thanks very, very much. This was wonderful. The quotations by Tom Schelling, Sam Nunn, I hope we all remember the wonky detail in describing the issues and the potential ways to defend against it. Thanks for coming to Arundel House. Please join me and thank you.